The quilt was the one my grandmother stitched the winter I was born. Double knot binding, blue and white. In the pitch black of that bedroom, I couldn't see the colors, but I knew every stitch by heart. I remember the exact texture of the heavy cotton under my fingers, because I was gripping it so hard, my knuckles had gone completely numb, white and stiff against the fabric. I was lying perfectly still, barely filling my lungs, trying to make my breathing quiet enough, shallow enough, that the man lying beside me would think I was fast asleep. I was 20 years old. I had been a married woman for exactly 6 hours, and I was crying, not with loud racking sobs, but with the slow, hot tears that leak out of the corners of your eyes and soak into the pillowcase without a sound. It was the kind of crying you do when you do not understand what you are actually crying about. I lay there in the dark, frozen, realizing that the world I knew had ended, and something entirely new, something cold and unmappable, had taken its place. I did not know what had just happened to me. I want you to understand exactly what I mean by that. I do not mean I was confused by the sudden change of life. I do not mean I was a nervous young bride, and the emotions of the day had finally overwhelmed me. I mean something much more literal. I mean I had never in my life seen a drawing of a man's body. I had never been told, even in whispers, what would happen in a marriage bed. The word sex had never been spoken to me. Not by my mother, not by my sisters, not by any woman in my community. I had entered that room the way you enter deep, freezing water in the dead of night. No map, no warning, no floor beneath my feet. I lay under my grandmother's quilt and realized that the silence I had lived in my entire life wasn't just quiet. It was a wall, and it had just trapped me inside. My name is Rachel. For 20 years, I was a daughter of the old order Amish, living in a world where everything had a place, a rhythm, and a rule. But that night, the rules broke something inside me that took a decade to put back together. I need to tell you how I got to that bed, because the silence didn't start on my wedding night. It started the day I was born. But before I go back to the beginning, before I walk you down the gravel roads of my childhood, I want to say something to you directly. This channel tells the stories that were never supposed to leave these houses. These are the narratives that women carried heavy in their bodies for decades, because there was no room, no language, and absolutely no permission to speak them out loud. If you have ever felt that kind of silence, the kind that doesn't just mean a lack of noise, but lives inside your chest like a heavy, immovable stone, then I want you to know that this is your place. If you want to help break that silence, take a moment right now to subscribe, to become a part of this space, so you can find out what happens when the truth is finally spoken. I want you to stay with me until the very end of this story, because there is a single sentence another woman said to me years later in a grocery store aisle that broke this whole world open. I will get to her. But first, you need to understand the weight of the quiet. I grew up in a house that smelled of wood smoke, fresh bread flour, and the faint, sharp sweetness of canning vinegar in the late summer. Our farm sat at the very end of a long gravel road in Lancaster County. 60 acres of green pasture, dairy cows, and a massive timber barn my grandfather built with wood he cut from the ridge himself. I was the fourth of 7 children, the second daughter, and my days had a beautiful, exhausting rhythm to them that I can still feel in my bones if I close my eyes. The 4:30 morning waking, the sharp thud of my father's boots on the wooden stairs, the metallic clink of the milk pails, and the low, steady murmur of my mother's voice reciting the morning prayer while her hands were already moving. Already kneading dough, already wiping down the linoleum counter. Everything in that house moved. Hands never stopped, and mouths were always careful. I say careful because that is the most honest word I have. We spoke plenty. We talked about the weather, the upcoming harvest, who was sick, and what clothes needed mending. We spoke about scripture and the right way to live a plain life. We spoke of duty, gratitude, and the danger of pride. But there were rooms in our language that simply had no doors. Whole territories of human experience did not exist in our vocabulary. The body was one of those territories. Not the working body. We knew that body intimately. The body that milked cows, planted seeds, hauled hay, and ached. No, it was the other body, the body that wanted, the body that bled, the body that would one day lie beside another body in the dark. That body had no words. It wasn't explicitly forbidden. It was something much quieter than forbidden. It was erased. To understand how a girl walks into that kind of darkness without screaming, you have to understand the architecture of the house she was built in. The silence wasn't a sudden curtain dropped on my wedding night. It was the foundation stone laid down before I could even speak. I remember the exact shade of gray the sky was when I was 12 years old, standing in our small downstairs bathroom. I had found a dark, terrifying smear of red in my underclothes. My throat went tight, dry as sawdust. I was convinced I was bleeding to death from the inside, that God had finally reached down to punish me for some secret, unnameable sin I couldn't even remember committing. I sat on the linoleum floor, my knees pulled tightly to my chest, sobbing into my apron so my brothers wouldn't hear me through the door. When my mother finally walked in, she didn't look shocked, and she didn't comfort me. Her face was as smooth and unreadable as the surface of a pond in winter. She reached into the wooden cabinet, pulled out a thick, white cloth folded into a neat square, and set it on my lap. "This will happen every month," she said, her voice flat even, dropping the words like small pebbles into a well. "You are becoming a woman now." That was it. That was the entirety of the talk. She didn't say the word menstruation. She didn't explain the mechanics of a body, or fertility, or why the blood came at all. She gave me a piece of fabric in a single sentence, and then she turned her back to tend to the iron stove. The silence wasn't just one generation deep. It was load-bearing. It kept the whole ceiling from falling in on us. By the time the blue linen dress was cut for my wedding day, the rules of my existence were as familiar to me as the weight of my own shoes. A husband leads. A wife follows. A wife submits. Children are a holy blessing, and you take exactly as many as the Lord provides. Your husband will know what to do. No one ever sat me down to say those things out loud. They were just the air we breathed. They were in the low, rhythmic drone of the ministers during the 3-hour Sunday sermons. The smell of hot wool and sweat filling the crowded rooms. They were in the quiet, knowing nods the older women exchanged when a young bride walked past the church wagons, her apron already fitting a little tighter around her middle just 3 months after her vows. The word bed was never spoken between women. It was replaced by a look, a tiny pause in conversation, a sudden turn of the head toward the window. You learned to read the empty spaces where the words should have been. Then came Samuel. I was 18 when I first really looked at him at a Sunday evening singing. The room was loud, thick with the scent of pine shave, and the sweet, heavy smell of the young people's pomade. His voice rose above the others, a low, steady bass that seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards under my boots. He had large, square hands, the skin calloused and stained dark from walnut hulling, and the handles of his father's plows. But he had a precision to him. He had built a cedar hope chest for his sister that summer, and the joints were so perfectly flush you couldn't have slid the edge of a sewing needle between them if you tried. When our eyes met across the long wooden table, he didn't laugh or boast like the other boys. The right corner of his mouth just hitched up a fraction of an inch, a tiny, almost smile, and something in my chest loosened, like a field thawing out under the first true sun of April. Our courtship was an exercise in perfect straight lines. We sat in my parents' front room, the oil lamp turned down low, while my mother snapped green beans or mended socks just one room over. "The north acreage will need lime this winter," Samuel would say, his eyes fixed on his own boots. "Yes," I would reply, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. "My father says the same." Outwardly, I was exactly what they wanted, quiet, compliant, nodding at the proper times. Inwardly, I mistook that vast, empty space of the unknown for a beautiful mystery. I liked him. He held the heavy buggy doors open. He bowed his head with genuine reverence during the long, silent prayers before meals, and he treated his mother with a gentle, protective deference. By every metric my world had given me, he was a good man. I had no reason to doubt the path, because you cannot fear a cliff when no one has ever told you that the ground can drop away. We married on a crisp Tuesday in November. The air smelled of dead leaves and cold mud. 300 people packed into the cleared-out clearing of his parents' barn. 4 hours of heavy, high German screeching, pressing down on us like a physical weight. I sat beside him on the hard backless bench, my fingers tracing the hem of the plain blue dress I had spent 3 weeks stitching by hand. Across the aisle, the long rows of married women sat shoulder to shoulder, their white prayer caps pinning their hair back tightly, their faces perfectly calm, perfectly certain. Every single one of them had sat on this exact bench. Every one of them had worn the same dress. They had all entered that next room, and not a single one of them had ever reached back to tell me what lived inside the dark there. During the wedding feast, while the tables groaned under the weight of roasted chicken and heavy yellow bowls of mashed potatoes, I caught the eye of Ruth. She was 15 years older than me, her skin already lined from 5 hard pregnancies and years under the summer sun. She stopped mid-stride, a heavy platter in her hands, and looked at me. Her face didn't hold a smile, and it didn't hold pity. It was an expression I had absolutely no name for then. A tight, frozen look that lasted for 2 agonizing seconds, before she abruptly turned her head and walked toward the kitchen. I didn't understand her face that afternoon. But years later, that look would be the very thing that broke the lock on my life. By evening, the crowd dissolved. The sound of horse hooves and iron-rimmed wheels grinding into the limestone gravel grew fainter and fainter until the farm fell completely still. My mother stood with me on the porch of the small old farmhouse his parents had cleared out for us. She pulled me close, the rough wool of her shawl scratching against my cheek. She held me a beat too long, her breath warm against my ear. "Be a good wife, Rachel," she whispered. She didn't say, "Here is what will happen when the lamp goes out." She didn't say, "Your body belongs to you, and you have the right to ask him to stop." She just said, "Be a good wife." Then she stepped down into the dark, climbed into my father's buggy, and left me standing there. The cold November wind rushed into the open hallway. I turned around, closed the heavy oak door, and heard the iron latch click into place. It sounded like a trap snapping shut. The bedroom smelled of lye soap, fresh line-dried linens, and the faint, dusty sweetness of the dried lavender my aunts had placed on the windowsill. Samuel was still out in the kitchen. Through the thin drywall, I could hear the heavy scrape of his wooden chair against the floorboards, the small, solitary clink of a drinking glass. He was giving me time. I understand that now from the distance of years. He was just as terrified as I was, carrying his own heavy, unspoken burdens. When he finally stepped into the room, he was gentle. He didn't rush or demand. He just looked at me standing there by the window in the white cotton nightgown my mother had stitched with those tiny, perfect collar seams, and he whispered, "It's all right." I nodded. I nodded because nodding was the only language I had left in my throat. I didn't know what I was agreeing to. I only knew that I was his wife now, and that every woman who had ever baked bread for me had walked into this exact dark and survived it. So, I figured it must be survivable. I will not describe the mechanics of what happened next on that mattress. Some silences are chosen, and this one is mine to keep. But I will tell you this. I did not understand what was happening to my skin. I did not know why it hurt so badly, or when the weight would leave, or that the word ready even existed for a woman's body. We were just 2 kids in a pitch-black room, both performing a script we had been commanded to follow, and neither of us understood that something precious was being ground into dust. When his breathing finally deepened into the heavy, slow rhythm of sleep, I lay perfectly still on my grandmother's blue and white quilt and let the tears run down the sides of my face. My jaw ached from clamping my teeth together to keep from making a sound. I felt completely erased, as if someone had taken a damp rag and wiped me right off the surface of my own life. At 4:30 the next morning, his leather boots hit the floorboards. The door creaked, and he went to the barn just like he had every morning of his life. I stood at the kitchen sink in the gray, bleeding dawn, plunging my hands into a basin of boiling dishwater, and I realized with a sudden cold shock that I couldn't feel the heat. I couldn't feel the zinc counter under my palms. I fried the eggs, I poured the black coffee, and when he told me the food was good, I whispered, Thank you. The nights continued like winter weather, regular, expected, and completely indifferent to whether I was ready for them. I became an expert at leaving my body. The moment I felt the shift in the air, the moment his hand touched my shoulder, I would locate that secret door in my mind and walk right through it. By the time he reached for me, I was already gone, floating somewhere with no walls and no weight, leaving an empty shell on the bedsheets. I got so good at it that I forgot I was doing it at all. I canned tomatoes in August, the kitchen choking with thick red steam, and felt absolutely nothing. A year into the marriage, my body began to scream in the only way it knew how. The silence turned into constant, grinding headaches that started at the base of my skull and wrapped around my forehead like a band of rusted iron. I went to a medical clinic 2 towns over, where our usual community doctor was away, and sat before a worldly woman with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She ran through her checklist, her pen scratching against the paper, and then she asked 4 words that stopped the clock on the wall. "Are you sexually active?" I just stared at her. No one had ever used that word in a sentence directed at me. No one had ever framed the act as a question, as something that required my personal perspective rather than my quiet compliance. That question dropped like a heavy stone into the frozen pond of my life, leaving a microscopic, jagged hairline crack in the silence. 2 years later, that crack split wide open. I saw Ruth in a grocery store 2 counties away. She had left the community by then, vanished into that particular heavy quiet we used to erase people who walked out. She was standing in the cereal aisle, wearing blue jeans and a knit sweater, her hair cut short and her white prayer cap completely gone. We stood under the humming fluorescent lights, looking at each other across a lifetime of unsaid things. She didn't offer small talk about the weather or the harvest. She looked straight into my eyes and asked, "How are you?" My voice broke into splinters on the linoleum floor. I whispered, "I don't think my wedding night was normal." Ruth didn't flinch or look away. She set her grocery box down on the shelf, looked at me with a terrifying, beautiful steadiness, and said, "They don't tell us on purpose, Rachel. Because if we knew what it was supposed to feel like, we might ask for something different. And the whole thing depends on us never asking." Looking back now, from the safety of the life I built later, I see the tragic friction of that world. I don't hate Samuel. He wasn't a monster. He was a boy who had been handed a tool by a system that told him it was his divine right to use it. He didn't know he was breaking me because the machine that built him didn't include a vocabulary for a woman's pain. The price of that beautiful, orderly, plain society was the systematic erasure of the people who maintained it. We paid for their peace with our own ghosts. It took me another 12 months after that conversation in the cereal aisle to finally walk away. I will not pretend the leaving was clean, or that it happened in one brave, cinematic moment. It was 100 agonizingly small decisions, each one making my hands shake. It was a library card hidden in the lining of my winter coat. It was a book about women's anatomy read under the bed sheets by the weak beam of a penlight. It was a desperate, whispering phone call to Ruth at 2 a.m. while the bathroom faucet ran to drown out my voice. When I finally left, the community did what it always does with things it cannot govern. It pulled the heavy curtain of silence over my name. To my mother, my father, and my sisters, I became a ghost. They chose to bury me in their minds while my heart was still beating. Years have passed since that day. Today, I live in a city apartment with smooth hardwood floors and large windows that let the morning sun pour all the way across the room. There is no smell of wood smoke or canning vinegar here. Instead, there is the clean scent of dark coffee and the quiet, steady hum of an electric refrigerator. I am sitting at a table I chose myself, looking out at a world that no longer has structural walls designed to keep me small. The door behind me is unlocked. It is always unlocked now. I can stand at my kitchen sink, plunge my hands into warm water, and feel every single drop against my skin. I am present. I am no longer floating away through secret doors. The machine I escaped is still running out there in the quiet countryside. Right now, as I speak these words, a blue linen dress is being measured and cut. Another young girl is being handed a handmade quilt and a mother's blessing, completely unaware of the deep, dark water she is about to be dropped into. I do not look back at them with burning anger. I look back with a profound, aching grief. The tragic friction of that life is realizing that the people who kept me in the dark were only passing down the exact same bruises they had been given. They truly believed they were protecting the sacred order of things. But a foundation built on enforced ignorance cannot hold forever. Your body has always been your own territory, even when an entire society spends generations trying to teach you that it belongs to God, to the community, or to a husband's duty. It was yours on the nights you stayed silent. It was yours when you forgot the sound of your own voice, and it is yours right now. I am telling this story because the walls only stand as long as the silence remains unbroken. If someone left you in the dark about your own body, your own boundaries, or your own worth, you do not have to carry that weight alone anymore. If you are willing to make a crack in that wall today, I invite you to leave just 3 words in the comments below. Nobody told me. You don't have to explain, and you don't have to give details. Just let those words be your witness, because I promise you, you will not be the only one writing them. If you believe these hidden voices deserve to be brought into the light, subscribe to this channel for our weekly stories.